All right. So we averted disaster. Bob didn't break his leg. This is good. So yeah, my name's Dave Riley. I was working for Culture Wars magazine for the past 2 years as a research assistant and an author. Been studying this kind of trend towards Marxism, liberalism, probably since like 2015. So I'm going to share with you some of the stuff that I've been mulling over for a while. So anyway, I've got a lot of slides, 88, and because we've only got 45 minutes, that means I've got to do about one slide every 45 seconds. So, critical race theory has been all the buzz recently, ever since Donald Trump signs an executive order on September 20th of 2020. The order, titled the Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, said, "This ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, that some people, simply on account of their race or sex, are oppressors, and that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings and Americans. Unfortunately, this malign ideology is now migrating from the fringes of American society and threatens to infect core institutions of our country. Instructors and materials teaching that men and members of certain races, as well as our most venerable institutions, are inherently sexist and racist, are appearing in workplace diversity teachings across the country, even in components of the federal government and among federal contractors." Might come as a surprise that Trump's executive order never actually mentioned the term critical race theory, nor its particular method of action. He mentions how it's un-American and how it flies in the face of what Martin Luther King wished to achieve in America, but he never mentions the undeniable fact that there is an anti-white bias occurring in America at the institutional level, in our law enforcement, such as the FBI, affirmative action programs, corporations pushing woke diversity, and most especially in our educational system. Another negligent error in the executive order that Trump signed is the idea that this malign ideology is now migrating from the fringes of American society, threatening to infect the core of our institutions. The unfortunate truth is that this malign ideology is not migrating to our core institutions, it actually emerged from them. And by the end of this talk, you'll find out exactly how that happened. Time magazine published an article entitled "President Trump Has Attacked Critical Race Theory. Here's what to know about the intellectual movement." It was published on September 29th of 2020, just days after Trump's EO was signed. A woman named Priscilla Osen, a professor at the Loyola Law School, said, quote, "Critical race theory is ultimately calling for a society that is egalitarian, a society that is just, a society that is inclusive. And in order to get there, we have to name the barriers to achieving a society that is inclusive. Our government at this moment, is essentially afraid of addressing our history of inequality, and if we can't address it, we can't change it." The Time magazine article went on to say, "Critical race theory offers a way of seeing the world that helps people recognize the effects of historical racism in modern American life. This intellectual movement behind the idea was started by legal scholars, as well as a way to examine how laws and systems uphold and perpetuate inequality for traditionally marginalized groups." The article continues, in Richard Delgado and John Stefanik's book, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction, they define critical race theory as a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. This is still Time magazine. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founding scholars of the CRT and the executive director and co-founder of the African American Policy Forum, says that critical race theory is, quote, "a practice. It's a way of seeing how the fiction of race has been transformed into a concrete racial inequity. It's an approach," this is Kimberly Crenshaw continuing, "it's an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past, and that the laws and systems that grow from that past are detached from it." So, we all know about fake news these days, thanks to Trump, so it wouldn't come as a surprise that Time magazine just lied to all of us in that article. What we're seeing from Time is actually what I will call a blackwashing of history, because the people who they purport to have created critical race theory most certainly did not. And the theory actually predates all of their tenures in academia. Since the mainstream media isn't going to give us an actual definition of the true history of what CRT is, I'll tell you. Critical race theory is a race-based philosophical and psychological critique of American society that is used to divide Americans from one another and to radicalize a catalyst group that has the potential to fundamentally transform America. But this isn't the full story. Here's one of the, sorry, this is disorganized. Here's one of the first examples, right? So when somebody's gone through critical race indoctrination, this is what comes out the other side.
All white people are racist. So I put this up because I really want any white person in the room to know up front that this is what we're dealing with, that it's not going to be this coddling of white tears and what that looks like. We're not going to discuss, oh, maybe some of us have worked it out. No, you're always going to be racist, actually. So even when you're on your path to trying to figure out how to be a better human being, because I believe that white people are born into not being human, like that actually, instead of people of color and black folks being dehumanized, that actually everyone is dehumanized off rip within white supremacy, that y'all are born into a life to not be human, and that's what y'all are taught to do, to be demons. So in this particular way, white people are all racist. So I just want y'all to know that up front.
Critical race theory is actually just one subset of a larger critical theory. The ultimate goal of critical theory is the destruction of Christianity and Western civilization as a whole in order to bring about a Marxist utopia. The process by which this will happen is by criticizing absolutely everything in society to death until the moral framework of that society has been relativized and corroded away, removing all moral and spiritual barriers to a Marxist revolution. You might think I'm being hyperbolic here, but once we look at the history, I think you'll come to the same conclusions that I've come to. And this is a little bit of a joke, but for the sake of time, we're going to be beginning our story in the mid-1800s, because that'll be very quick, right? The Catholic Church had just elected a staunchly anti-liberal Pope, Pius IX. Europe had just finished undergoing radical transformations, one in the form of the Enlightenment, which brought about the notions of liberty, fraternity, and equality, and found its culmination in the French Revolution, which proudly declared that the people no longer wanted to be ruled by a king, since having a king isn't egalitarian. The other factor here is the Industrial Revolution, the consequences of which are still being felt today. Within a single lifetime, most of Europe went from living an agrarian lifestyle to living in filthy cities surrounded by new machines that displaced them from their old jobs, took the people away from their families, and they invented an entirely new economic system to deal with that change: capitalism. In the summer of 1848, one country after another had out-and-out revolutions, or at least they shored up secular democracies supplanting the king through legislation. Romania, Belgium, Ireland, Sweden, Austria, Italy, Serbia, France, Germany, and Hungary all had violent revolutions that summer. And just weeks after those revolutions took place, Karl Marx published his book, The Communist Manifesto, seeking to co-opt the revolutionary potential of these angry people and attempt to bring about his own kind of utopia. Unfortunately for Marx, his theory that the now industrialized, liberalized democratic societies in Western Europe did not fall for his false promises, and the communist revolution never took place. Zooming out and going back to the eastern front of Europe, a revolutionary group of people called the Narodnaya Volia, or the People's Will in Russian, literally invented political terrorism as we know it today, when they assassinated Tsar Alexander II using dynamite as a weapon for the first time in history. Although Alexander II was most definitely a liberal, enacting all kinds of social reforms and emancipations, the overall process of liberalization that took place in Western Europe had not taken the same hold in the East. They were attempting to destroy the concept of a czar by killing the czar himself. They failed, and Alexander III assumed the throne of his father, reversing most of the liberal reforms of Alexander II because he had obviously given the terrorists a lot of leeway. Right? Not long after, another assassination attempt from the Narodnaya Volia was uncovered. The man was Alexander Ulanov, Vladimir Lenin's older brother. Along with 6 other revolutionaries, they hung them. So we're going to fast forward to the beginning of World War I. Marxist theorists have been agitating the populations of Germany, France, and Italy in the hope that their weakened states, which were at war, they could more easily implement a communist revolution, when seemingly out of nowhere, nobody predicted that the revolution would actually be taking place in Russia. It really threw Marxist philosophers for a jolt. The end of World War I, there were similar and smaller communist revolutions in Western Europe, most notably during the German Civil War, which you probably don't know about, of 1918 to 1919, when the Spartan uprising alienated most of Bavaria from the German people, setting up the Bavarian Soviet Republic under the leadership of a guy named Kurt Eisner, right? To quote Wikipedia about Kurt Eisner, quote, "None of the leaders were native Bavarians. They were bohemians and intellectuals, many of them Jewish, who were conspicuous in their anti-bourgeois bias. Those from the right called Eisner a foreign, racially alien vagabond and a Bolshevist, and his associates as unscrupulous alien scoundrels, Jewish rascals, misleaders of labor. Eisner did not help matters by declaring his regime would have a government by kindness and would create a, quote, realm of light, beauty, and reason. There were frequent spectacles such as parades, demonstrations, concerts, and speeches, but the regime's philosophical utopianism won over very few converts. They were trying to entice people to join the Bavarian Soviet Republic by promising a better future. It didn't work. Eisner was assassinated not long after, sending the communist state into turmoil, and eventually 20,000 anti-communist Bavarians rose up against the revolutionaries and executed about 1,200 communists. This is what finally brings us to critical theory, founded by a group of people called the Frankfurt School of Philosophers. They were a bunch of Marxist philosophers, psychoanalysts, and intellectuals that came together primarily to understand why the communist revolution had not taken place in Germany, right? Where classical Marxian theory predicted it would happen in these industrialized Western societies, Italy, France, Germany, yada, yada. They start at a point of understanding that something had gone deeply wrong with Western civilization because the Marxist revolution failed. And they sought to critique these, quote, failures of Western societies in order to bring about their own Marxist kind of a thing. So the people involved with this: Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. So it started in Germany, in Frankfurt. Max Horkheimer was the director of the institute. He rejected orthodox Marxism in favor of different applications of Marxian theory as opposed to just applying it to economics. He figured he could apply Marxian theory to all aspects of society. He wasn't wrong. He laid the foundation for critical theory. Critical theory, says Horkheimer, is, quote, suspicious of the very categories of things like better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable, as those concepts are understood in the present order. And basically what he said is that if you like ice cream better than cake, or if you think that a hammer might be more useful than a screwdriver in a particular situation, you were speaking on behalf of the status quo. And that's bad, because the status quo is broken, because you guys didn't have a communist revolution, so everything's got to go. Here is him in his own words about the founding of critical theory.
Der kritischen Theorie, wie ich sie dann auch später noch entwickelt habe, liegt der Gedanke zugrunde, dass man das, was gut ist, also die gute, die freie Gesellschaft, in der Gesellschaft, in der wir jetzt leben, nicht bestimmen kann. Dazu fehlt es uns. Aber wir können die negativen Seiten dieser Gesellschaft, die wir verändern wollen, die können wir aussprechen.
So the idea is that we can't even understand what a good society is living in this society. We have to destroy the society first and then figure out what a good society is later. Incredible. One of the other leaders, Theodor Adorno, he was one of the leading members of the Institute. He rejected ideas like ontology and empiricism. Ontology is the study of being as it is, and empiricism is the idea that we can use instruments and our senses to measure actual things in real life. He didn't like that. He didn't like empirical data. He was much more into aesthetics and culture and feelings. He was very, very difficult to read. I do not recommend picking up any of his books. It's bad. As a matter of fact, one of the books that he worked on is this guy, which we'll be getting to in just a second. It's called The Authoritarian Personality. Back to Adorno, one of his critiques of modern art and popular culture was that television and movies weren't catering to public tastes, they were actually shaping them. That's true, though. That's what's happening. So all popular art had to be criticized as a symptom of the capitalist system and torn down and replaced by things like, pardon me, Robert Mapplethorpe's Piss Christ. I'm sure you've all heard about that. Maybe you haven't. It's disgusting. All these vulgar performance art acts are based on Adorno's theory of art. So Horkheimer and Adorno worked together, like I said, to create this, which is called the authoritarian personality, which is ultimately their study that was sponsored by the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation in 1950. This study basically pathologizes all Western traditions, Western culture, Western morality, right? They got a lot of grants and were using very primitive computers to collect data to try and find out why the people rejected the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Why did they come together and throw the communists out?
Okay, so I was only vaguely aware of the Bavarian Socialist Republic. It lasted a couple months.
Yeah.
But I just looked it up. They had like 30,000 soldiers. I mean, they did take over.
They took over the entire landmass, yeah, of Bavaria. That's right.
Are you saying that these guys from the Frankfurt Institute, which, many people know about that, did they, were they involved in that?
I don't know if they were involved in that or not, but they were studying that as it was happening. They were trying to understand how a communist revolution has an impact on the psychology and sociology of a society where it's being implemented, because they want to be able to reproduce that later in other countries.
All I know, I never heard of that. And I grew up in Germany.
Yeah.
We weren't allowed to.
You weren't allowed to learn about that?
No.
No, you weren't. So, for example, I'll read just a quick passage from The Authoritarian Personality. Check this out. Another expression of repression. They were all about repression, the idea that sexual repression leads to violence, right? So, the sexual economy, I guess you could say, frequently doing things with yourself is good for society because it makes you less violent. I don't know if I'm being polite enough, but this is them, it's not me. Don't blame me. Another expression of repression, this time primarily of sex and aggression, is authoritarian moralism. By this is meant a moral indignation about manifestations of what is considered improper behavior, especially when it occurs in persons considered socially inferior. This mechanism gives the opportunity for both the release of aggression towards someone who cannot very well retaliate and for projecting repressed sexual needs onto an alien group. Since this mechanism, of which ethnic prejudice is but a part, is widespread and socially accepted, and a kind of pseudo-reality is thus constructed, which helps to keep the individual unaware of his distortions. So they've pathologized, like when you go to the club and you see people like twerking and miming sex in public, and that kind of disgusts you a little bit, you are actually an authoritarian moralist, and you are living in a delusional reality.
And to be clear, the Frankfurt Institute was in New York, right? Not Frankfurt.
It started in 1918, 1919 in Frankfurt, in Germany. In 1933, they all left, right? They all left. So, for example, Theodor Adorno, after he left Germany in 1933, guess where he went? Columbia University, Princeton, right? Horkheimer, same thing. Herbert Marcuse is another one. He was kind of the very less esoteric, obviously, than Adorno and Horkheimer. Definitely a lot more personable. He was the father of the New American Left. And from 1943 to 1950, he worked as an OSS CIA agent. OSS is the precursor to the CIA. He taught at Columbia, Harvard, Brandeis, and University of California, San Diego. And he led the Berkeley Uprising of 1969. Marcuse's flagship book, Eros and Civilization, essentially made Wilhelm Reich's case that sexual liberation was the best counter to the psychological ills of society, preferring a society full of, quote, polymorphous perversity as opposed to the, quote, repressive traditional values of Christianity and Western civilization. Let's do some Herbert Marcuse in his own words so you know I'm not lying to you.
The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness.
There you go. So that's him on the student movements. He was very involved with the Black Panthers, the SDS, which of course later became the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, a terrorist organization of the New Left in America. When asked about the biggest contribution of the Frankfurt School, this is his answer.
The interdisciplinary approach to the great social and political problems of the time, cutting across the academic division of labor, applying sociology, psychology, philosophy to the understanding and developing of the problems of the time. And in my view, the most interesting contribution, the attempt to answer the question, what actually has gone wrong in Western civilization, that at the very height of technical progress, we see at the same time the opposite as far as human progress is concerned.
Right? I'm not making this up. It really is the first time, though, that, and it's very interesting, the Frankfurt School used a very unique blend of Freudian psychology along with Marxist theory. It was a blend of the two. Whereas before you had Freudian psychology, which would kind of critique society and people as a whole, and then you would have Marxist theory, which would kind of look at the economic aspect of things. The unique aspect of the Frankfurt School was the combining of both of them and then the application of these theories to literally every facet in society. One, maybe two more. When asked about the features of American society, this is what Marcuse said.
As features of this society, I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
Interesting, right? We hear all of it, racism, sexism, the environment, all of these things that we're dealing with today in their nation state from the mouth of the people that created this agenda. One more of Herbert Marcuse talking about where he's putting his efforts now. This was filmed in 1977. So where yes, he was a professor at Harvard, UC, San Diego, Brandeis, and Princeton or Columbia University. I can't remember which, but he made the rounds, that's for sure. So this is the last video of Marcuse that we'll look at. Where are your efforts now? Where should other Marxist theorists be paying attention?
And I would say that far more attention should be paid to the women's liberation movement. I see in the women's liberation movement today a very strong radical potential. All domination in recorded history up to date was patriarchal domination. So if we should indeed live to see not only a equality of the woman before the law or whatever it is, but the deployment of what is called the specific feminine qualities throughout the society. For example, non-violence, receptivity, tenderness. This would indeed be, or perhaps could be, the beginning of a qualitatively different society, the very antithesis to male domination with its violent and brutal character.
So just to tag on to the end of that, one of the parts of the authoritarian personality was the creation of something called the F scale, which is any society's potential to become fascist and to rid themselves of degeneracy and to go back to, traditional Western values, right? So if you score high on the F scale, that means you have a high potential to authoritarian behavior, right? And so they were trying to figure out how that functioned in society. So one of the parts of the study says, since the typical low-scoring man readily accepts his own femininity than the high scorer, and the low-scoring woman her masculine strivings, one important source of a hidden aggression towards the opposite sex and toward other people generally, it seems, is reduced. So if we take the men and turn them into women, and we take the women and we turn them into men, it reduces the authoritarian tendency. There are also a lot of studies that show that viewing pornography actually makes men liberal. It's true, it's true, it's true. Okay, one last guy for the Frankfurt School before we move on. Erich Fromm, he's a psychoanalyst, founder of socialist humanism. He later was rejected by Marcuse, Adorno, and Horkheimer for his divergence on Freudian psychology. But he did have a very big influence on Dr. Benjamin Spock. Does anybody know about Benjamin Spock? I bet a lot of people here do. He did the parenting handbooks, right? So the whole every kid gets a trophy. Yeah, that's Erich Fromm. That's from Erich Fromm. So that just shows you how deeply penetrated into society their ideas already are, right? So Herbert Marcuse, like I said, he led various uprisings in the 1960s with the SDS, with student youth movements and all this kind of stuff. But when you go to Wikipedia to look up critical race theory, you don't see any of it. It's not there. Like I said, they've blackwashed. Forgive the term, I guess, but they've blackwashed the history of critical race theory. They attribute it to Richard Delgado, who's a professor at the University of Alabama, Patricia Williams, a professor at Columbia University, Cheryl Harris at UCLA Law, Mari Matsuda at UCLA and Georgetown, Derek Bell, who taught at Harvard and NYU. He was the first black man, I guess, given tenure at Harvard. That's his claim to fame. And Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, notable for being one of the legal team members accusing Clarence Thomas of sexual indiscretion, and also for the development of the theory of intersectionality. Of all of the people purported by Wikipedia, Time Magazine, and all of the other mainstream sources, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is probably the closest to actually she's probably close to actually having something to do with critical race theory, right? I'll read you her bio. She's an American lawyer, civil rights activist, philosopher, and a leading scholar of critical race theory who, quote, developed the theory of intersectionality. She's a full-time professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, where she specializes in race and gender issues. Crenshaw is also the founder of Columbia Law School's Center for Intersectionality and for Social Policy Studies, which is abbreviated CISPS, who cares? But together with an old associate of hers, a woman named Angela Davis, she founded African American Agenda 2000. Now here's why I think that Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is actually kind of close to the nexus of this thing. Her old friend, Angela Davis, that she founded the African American Agenda with, was one of Herbert Marcuse's right-hand students. She studied at Brandeis while Herbert Marcuse was at Brandeis. She studied at Columbia. She studied at University of California, San Diego, all during Marcuse's tenure. And the uprisings of 1968 and 1969, dealing with things like free speech and academic freedom, were because Angela Davis was fired from her post at University of California, San Diego, for providing firearms to the Black Panther Party and for being an avowed communist. Right, so these are some pictures from the time, Free Angela Davis, Youth Against War and Fascism, right? It's like Antifa. Here's Herbert Marcuse, that's Angela Davis's mother there in the back. Another picture, Angela Davis with Che Guevara. And again, back to this student uprising. So, go ahead.
How did this, at this time when you're talking, affect the everyday guy going to work, coming home?
Didn't. It didn't. It affected academia.
That's right. And that's why nobody hears about it.
Right. Right, and that's how they were able to do it so quietly. They basically took over all of academia by 1975. Almost every tenured professor at that point was into critical race theory.
What's the, there's a famous Lenin quote, I'm not going to, give me 4 years and the seeds that I have sown cannot be uprooted.
Yep, that's right. They go after the kids.
I'm not going to leave this.
I've got, what, 14 minutes, quickly.
Angela Davis.
Yes.
Just, you know how they say his name.
Right.
Judge Harold Halley. His head was blown off on August 7th, 1970 by a shotgun bought by Dr. Angela Davis on August 5th, 1970.
Right.
Yeah, Judge Harold Halley hasn't been mentioned in the New York Times, but like 3 times every time Angela Davis is mentioned, they should say Harold Halley's name.
Right. Say his name. Say his name. Well, so anyway, the point of this thing, though, is that Angela Davis most definitely was a critical theorist. She most definitely learned everything that she knew from the Frankfurt School, from Herbert Marcuse personally. I mean, we have pictures of them together, right? But the point is that because of this mishap with the Black Panthers, there was a tarnish on her record, and they couldn't put her in the forefront anymore to be the leading scholar, the leading person pushing critical race theory, right? They had to find Kimberly Crenshaw, her friend, to kind of push forward, right? Because she was clean, right? Now, remember the SDS. SDS was very involved with pushing for Angela Davis's release in the late 1960s. Going back to the Wikipedia article for critical race theory, where obviously you still see none of this stuff, one of the other groups that's mentioned is Sojourner Truth, right? Except that when you're on Wikipedia and you click on that link, it takes you to Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Bumfree in 1797 to 1883. She's not a critical race theorist. She has nothing to do with it. You don't want to know what that was supposed to link to? The Sojourner Truth Organization. Okay? Sojourner Truth Organization was a new communist group formed in the winter of 1969, prominent in the Midwest throughout 1985. Oriented towards organization in the workplace and named after African-American activist Sojourner Truth, the organization distinguished itself from other New Left groups in its critical approach to the role of race in the formation of the American working class. And a man named Noel Ignatiev, a former leader of the Students for the Democratic Society, became a prominent member of Sojourner Truth Organization and expressed the group's sentiments thusly. And this is coming from a book by Laird Wilcox. If anybody, I love this book. Costs a lot. You can't get it anymore. It's out of print. Really good book. It's called The Watchdogs. I highly recommend it. Noel Ignatiev, Revolutionary. In the article in 1995 issue of Love and Rage, an anarchist tabloid, Joel Olson commented on Ignatiev as follows, quote, Noel Ignatiev put forth the position that the purpose of any revolutionary organization should be to build a, quote, dual power strategy, which means that our political work should be geared towards building resistance movements. In this way, we could link revolutionary urges, everyone hates the cops, to a revolutionary counterpower that challenges the main pillar upholding capitalism and white supremacy, the state and their pigs. Love and Rage is a publication of the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation, whose motto is, quote, governments don't fall by themselves, they need your help. Join the Federation. So this is this guy, Noel Ignatiev. He's basically the mouthpiece, the leader, the main thinker of Sojourner Truth Organization, which is mislabeled in Wikipedia, never mentioned in the media, and there's a reason for it. We'll hear why from Noel Ignatiev's own mouth.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. If you abolish slavery, you abolish slaveholders. In the same way, if you abolish racial oppression, you do away with whiteness. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
Your views are fairly well received in academia.
Yes, they're legitimate, not to say that everyone agrees, but sure. I could not point to any examples where it has provoked political censorship. Whiteness is an identity that arises entirely out of oppression. Whiteness is not a culture, it's not a religion, it's not a language, it's simply an oppressive social category. Blackness is an identity that can be plausibly argued. Black studies is the study of a people that has formed itself in resistance to its oppression. The task is to bring this minority together in such a way that it makes it impossible for the legacy of whiteness to continue to reproduce itself.
I'm not making this up. So at the beginning of this talk, I claimed that critical race theory is an anti-white, discriminatory, racist ideology. You heard it from one of the actual people's mouths, as opposed to the people that Time magazine would purport to have founded this group, like Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She's just the kind of nice face that they put on it because she doesn't have videos of her talking about genociding the white race because she didn't buy guns for the Black Panther Party and help assassinate a judge, right? Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is also being used to bring in people like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, which if you watch Fox News, I'm sure you've seen discussed ad nauseum. All kinds of corporations and colleges are making this mandatory reading. And the next one is going to be this guy, Ibrahim Kendi from Boston University, who wrote this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And to try and tie this back into some things that we've also discussed here at the Pachyderms, the World Economic Forum is pushing this stuff too, right? They reject the idea that racism stems from, it's such a straw man argument. Racism stems from defective hearts and minds. What? I mean, maybe you could call it like, and if an individual has a personal prejudice against somebody and then they act on that prejudice, that could be racism, but they don't even have that. They say racist behaviors stem from defective hearts and minds. That's their definition of racism. They reject it. And instead, they have the definition, racism is the pattern of behaviors that disadvantage one racial group in favor of another, right? That definition opens things up to the idea of systemic racism, systemic injustice, the idea that the entire system needs to be completely reformed. So, critical race theory is an anti-white, Marxist ideology made up of Freudian psychology and Marxist theory married together by the Frankfurt School in the 1930s through the 1950s, and then promulgated in our institutions, in the universities. And it's these people like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm. These are the people who have been teaching all of us for the past 70 years. So the idea that this is something that just came out, that this is just now starting to come into our institutions, is a lie, because it's already won. It's already won. Go ahead.
Do you know why these Germans came to America and didn't stay over there?
Yeah, Hitler got elected.
That's a good reason for anybody to leave.
That's why.
I'm not sure if you're aware of what's going on in Seattle area.
Chaz?
No, not Chaz.
I was going to say, actually, Chaz is actually very similar to what the Bavarian Soviet Republic was like, right? Where they just kind of come into a city, or the Paris Commune, or in Hungary. It's the same kind of situation where a group of people imposes itself on a city, and obviously it's still not quite there yet. They've still got some work to do, but it's coming. Yeah.
My point was on the west side of this state. Like right now, they're also discriminating out Asian Americans. Now the University of Washington Medical says, "Oh, we're not going to take any more Asians."
Right.
There are listed white privileges.
Right. Well, that's because whiteness is. Once they're done dealing with white people, all right, then they're going to talk about white thinking and white belief systems and how grammar is racist and math is racist. And it even goes into things like what you could say, what's that stupid educational style of Common Core, where it has nothing to do about getting the right answer on a test. It has everything to do about the process of how you got to the wrong answer. If you did the process right, but you got the answer wrong, it's still right. That's what Common Core is.
And they're also criticized, they're also recategorized Asians as non-color. Now they say Asian people are white people.
Sorry, that sucks, but yeah, it's true. I haven't heard from you. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I've got two. It may sound like three questions.
Fine. We've got 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
30 seconds, if you just give me an opportunity. Now, number one, what's your educational background, schools and degrees? Number two, how do they deal with the Turkish incursion into Iceland?
Don't know anything about Turkish incursion into Iceland.
That's a mistake. You need to learn.
Okay.
Just
And what
ask-
year? What year? What year?
Oh, I don't know. It was after the Protestant era, so it'd be after the 1500s, probably 1700s, 1600s.
Fascinating.
And the Africans came up and captured over 400 white women, children.
Right, white slavery. I've heard about that. I know about that.
And how do they deal with that? I mean, there was white slavery, the Amalfi Coast, for years and years. You go there on your fancy Italian vacations and you can see that, and I'm going to give you your time back so you can answer.
Yeah, no, that's I'm not into. That's not a field of study that I'm particularly involved with. I haven't looked into it. I know about it. I know that it's there for sure. The way that critical theory casts white people as being, the slave holders, the slave traffickers, and all this kind of stuff, making it exclusively white people that do it, when in fact we still have cultures today in the Middle East that participate in this kind of stuff. It's a gross misrepresentation of slavery, I think, and it's a terrible indictment of people.
But you made the mistake of not giving me your educational background.
That's not a mistake. I don't believe in credentialism.
First, you said that President Trump signed the executive order.
That's right.
On critical race theory.
Right.
Explain that. I'm kind of confused.
He signed an order. He signed an order on September 20th of 2020 called the Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. And all of the media went crazy saying that he was attacking critical race theory, even though Trump never even mentioned it.
Okay, I got you.
So that's what happened there.
Okay, one question before he stands up.
Yeah.
What would you suggest? Okay, we all know the Coraline School District and all this other stuff that you do.
Yes.
What do you suggest that the parents do, or anything we could do to get rid of it?
Homeschool.
What? Let's
That's not gonna work.
Homeschool.
I know it's good. That's
They
not good. That's not
denied
gonna
it
work.
when I asked them.
They
They said we don't have that.
Right. Well, they're lying to you because as a part of their equity framework, you can go right into the back. I don't.
say it's different. They say it's all different and all that.
It's not. It's not. It's fundamentally the same. You can even look in the footnotes. In the footnotes for the new equity framework, footnote number 2 is Connor and Ferry disability critical race studies, theorizing at the intersections of race and disability. So they're lying. They're lying.
As grandparents and everything like that, to get rid of this.
Vote for candidates for school board.
You can't. They control
That
the
sounds
news,
easy.
they control the information.
It's over.
You know, we need to start with our own institutions.
Yes.
Like, don't worry about this. I mean, yes, worry about the school board and stuff, but even, okay, check this out. About a year ago, at the Republican Women Organization, right, they were giving out these stickers for the Love Lives Here stickers from the Human Rights Organization here in town, because one of the members, her daughter, is the executive director of the local human rights organization. So it's like we need to clean up our own groups first,
Yep.
and then we can start attacking, and cleaning them out of the other groups.
What do you mean
So-
our own group?
Or Republican women, right? They were giving out those.
I'm 30 seconds over.
Tell them that?
I wasn't there. My wife did though. Yeah.
Okay, Bjorn, I'm 30 seconds over, but I'm just gonna, for anybody with a pen and paper, all of this stuff that I was talking about today was sourced, starting with Andrew Breitbart's Righteous Indignation, Show and Tell Time. Very good book. Try to get a copy. They don't print them anymore. They're pretty expensive. Another book is The Culture of Critique, which is basically like real in-depth on the Frankfurt School and critical theory. Good book, expensive, again, out of print. And then again, if you really want to go heavy, you can get The Authoritarian Personality and see what their standardized testing was like. One of the other elements of this thing that I forgot to mention was that in conjunction with the forming of The Authoritarian Personality, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation was working with Harvard professors like Charles Murray, who's the founder of the modern understanding of like assessment centers. So if you want to be a manager at like Walmart, you got to go to an assessment center, take a personality test, and then they hire you based on that. So all institutions have been implementing that. The cops, the FBI, CIA, DOJ, DHS, all of them use this kind of standardized testing, and all of it was written by these people to weed out what they called racist, white supremacist, people that are traditionally minded, people that are moral, people that are Christian. So the idea of reforming the institutions is very difficult for me to buy. But have kids, get married, homeschool, wait it out, because their society is against nature and it will collapse.
David, this sounds like groundbreaking research that you've done here. Are you writing an article or a book that documents all this?
I could.
Would you, please? and get it published so that we can get this out to people?
Yeah, I'll work on it. That will not happen. Never. That'll never happen. Anyway, that's all I got, and I'm over. So. Well, no. I could keep going.
Does he deserve a mug?
He deserves a mug.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So, red, white, and blue, courtesy of Herb.
Thank you, Herb.
And on the back here, as you know, you got to say this loud and clear before I give it to you.
Free government requires active citizens. That's true. Thank you.
Can I just take just a split second just to talk about where Love Lives Here came from? Just really fast. Is it okay? Yeah. Take like 30 seconds. So Laura Kenninson became a fellow at the Western State Center out of Portland, Oregon, okay? They helped her foster this group, Love Lives Here, and was then picked up by the Human Rights and Education Institute as one of their campaigns. But the director of the Western State Center is Eric Ward, and Eric Ward is also a senior fellow at the SPLC. That's right. Just an example of how this works, okay? So we'll be exposing a lot more of this as time goes on. You can see a video of this on my YouTube channel, North Idaho Exposed, called Identify Your Local Cultural Marxist Institutions, that talks about creation of Love Lives Here.
And actually, I was going to say, Casey has a great video of Summer Bushnell, where she, I guess, Skyped into the Idaho House and did a critique of the equity framework put forward by Coeur d'Alene School District. So if you want to know more about that equity framework, you could definitely see Summer Bushnell's presentation on that on his YouTube channel.
So in answer to Doug's question, how does it affect the common person? We're all paying for it, right? It all filters down from guys like that you showed on the TV to the people that bother us here in person.
That's right.
There's a chain.
Right.
Help independent journalism thrive. If you enjoyed this content, help with a donation through Cash App at North Idaho Exposed or on Venmo, North Idaho Exposed. Thank you.